The truly difficult part about the history of Freemasonry is how complicated, difficult, detailed, and layered it is. The layering of the history of Freemasonry it's like a complicated quantum physics equation. It has layers and layers and layers, and some layers have branches of layers within them. And on occasion, some of those side branches that have branches within them have secondary side branches that are also layered and detailed and complicated. But it's all one subject, even though there's 50 million moving parts to it from Noah to present. Freemasonry is insanely complicated, but when you break it down variable by variable, equation branch by equation branch, it can actually start to make sense. Where everything began is with chapter 6, Genesis. Genesis chapter 6 begins with a direct physical reference to the Nephilim. The Nephilim were half divine creatures and half human females that were, in some aspects, positive or negatively, used as vehicles to deliver children that were half human, half divine. Those children were called Nephilim. And those Nephilim, being half divine and half not exactly stupid human, would be smart, would be intelligent, would want to create education, would want to create a library, would want to create a sequence where one generation teaches the next generation, teaches the next generation, and a body of knowledge comes from those sequences. The entire top portion of chapter 6 is entirely about the Nephilim. The bottom part of chapter 6 is entirely about the bad people that were being difficult to Noah and his family, and him needing to build an ark, which required engineering. Noah and the Nephilim got together to build the ark, at least one, which means that the 2x2 is not animals of the world, which is, in truth, using the scientific method, strains credulity. However, containing a library, containing several, if not a lot, of Nephilim, and containing in effect, a tabernacle system of Adam that by that time had been in existence for at least 1,000 years, is entirely realistic, entirely plausible, entirely possible, and has a massive amount of scientific evidence to back it up. Physical, tangible stuff. Not the least amount of evidence would be Hagia Sophia, that used to have Kaabahs inside of it, 4. The Kaaba in Mecca, which there used to be 4 of them, not 1, is an almost complete lack of formalized understanding of the structure previous to the finishing of the King Solomon's Temple at 1000 BC. Most people don't even have any idea what the building even looked like, let alone how the building was put together. The basic architectural structure has been lost to history. Zerubbabel's temple is semi-well known, but Zerubbabel changed the design to be a laying down human. When it's time, the building will stand up again, almost entirely not unlike the definition of Northumberland. The head stands up, the head being sacred, heart being sacred, and they stand up. North, vertical, standing up. going from in effect the Ben stone, and of course the Temple Mount being a defined area with both permanent rock in a geological formation, as well as all the millions of tons of rock that were brought in to shape the walls. Some of those rocks were put in place by unknown technology. It's doubtful that even today's heavy lift cranes could achieve the goal in an efficient manner, other than one crane on one side and one crane on the other, but getting the rocks, the bricks that are 15 by 10 by unknown, getting those to the site, that's an entirely different matter altogether, and it's even doubtful if they might even be too heavy for a train to take. Too big, long, and heavy for a train. That this may be how did they do this with granite? And saying the rollers is unrealistic, because no matter how many logs are going to be used, after just a short amount of time, those logs would be pulverized. The weight is just too much. It will also take thousands of people pushing and pulling at the same time, and taking several 100-pound logs and putting them in front of as the logs roll. This is fantasy. The amount of energy and amount of power necessary is, plus the fact that where are they going to find trees that big within 500 miles? Totally unrealistic. Verging on fiction based off of no base of evidence. So they had to use something else. What that something else ties directly into why Noah built his ark in the first place. Now, it is absolutely 100% written clear. The Nephilim are mentioned before the construction of Noah's ark, and they're mentioned immediately after Noah's ark. Which means that the statistically speaking, most likely realistic, based on the following of the scientific method and other various and assorted aspects of science, statistics, and following the rules of both quantum physics and applied physics, which would be Newtonian and Einstein physics, as well as a healthy dose of Hupp and Heisenberg-Rosen concepts. Location A was wherever the Noah started building his ark. Location B would be wherever Mount Sinai was. The amount of conquests and conquering and this and that and the next thing and renaming things and hatred of Jews, hatred of the Semitics, hatred of knowledge and education, there is no way to determine where Mount Ararat is. An unknown location that was renamed by the Ottomans when they seized control over the area. The Romans had no interest in telling the truth about the Jews. The Hyksos have less than no interest in telling the truth about the Jews. The Dorians, forget about it. The Muslims from the Ottoman Empire, again, forget about it. They're not telling the truth. So we have no idea where Mount Ararat. But what is clear is the fact that in the thousands of archaeological digs and surveys and satellite images and tourists coming to that area, there is zero realistic evidence that suggests that anything other than a possibility of a replacement was built sometime in the last 6,000 years. A homage, a temple to the original construction, but not the actual real one. There's been so much emphasis on that mountain that it's entirely possible. In fact, it's completely statistically realistic to assume that the real one was moved from location A, point of construction, location B, Mount Ararat, and then moved to location C, which would be docked next to the Temple of IWNW, which in Indo-European, because hieroglyphics would not exist for 300 years, this is 4000 BC, the very, very earliest proto, 3 times proto form of hieroglyphic would not exist until 3700 BC. This is 4000 BC. This is 200 to 300 years before then. There's 6 generations, 7 generations between the X and Y coordinates of 4000 BC and 3700 BC. Of course, this also does lend to when the not yet named this for 2,000 years Hyksos invaded from Mecca. They did so, and they took the previous language and they took their language and they mixed them together to make a brand new language, which would then be considered to be hieroglyphics. Because they had conquered Thebes and Hierapolis after the libraries were taken out. Everything that can be moved was moved first to the city of Lutz. 1,000 years later was renamed to be Memphis to honor Abraham by Jacob, and he is the one that put his children to task for the next 300 years to build the pyramids, to reflect the stories and the intricate details of Judaism. What did not exist yet, so the children of Israel. Having the children of Israel have their story told in a form that was nowhere in the neighborhood of easy to destroy. Burning a book, it takes 15-20 minutes, depending on how hot the fire is. No problem. Just open it up, break the spine, throw it on the fire, gone. Ashes bits and pieces of the ashes and such might last a few hours, but the fire is so hot that they're going to be turned to carbon within 45 minutes anyway. So a little bit of stirring of the ashes, a little bit of stirring of the carbon of the book, and it's all ash. It's all floating in the wind. Stone building using architecture is an entirely different aspect of how to maintain a library. And completely realistic, because there are aspects of the weave talked about in the 4 trees of creation, Genesis 2:9. The limbs from tree A, and tree B, tree C, and tree D, we are woven together to create some type of a canopy, for lack of a better word. And that canopy and its major branches and its minor branches and yearly branches and leaves and such would be woven together by Adam and, of course, Eve, in order to be able to produce the necessary weave to achieve other goals. Those are the goals. Some references in the Talmud are referenceable from various and assorted Jewish forms of entertainment that I'm not familiar with what book and what chapter and verse, but I remember them from stories like Yentl. But you have to see the story as if Adam is doing a metaphoric, creating the fabric of the earth, creating the fabric of living things and living beings and such. All the things that are in the garden, Adam was put in charge of, which is the job of the steward. Now, that job is a little bit more complicated than it is explained, mostly because the job is, in effect, knowing when to cut some kind of a branch or leaf or what have you, and that becomes the lifeline, the life force, the existence of, the physical existence of a farm animal or a bird or some of the, whatever type of animals and creatures and plants and the like Adam was put in charge of, and he would then have to make the existence of that animal, that thing, that what have you, and he would then have to include it into the weave that he was making, where it would begin and what its lifespan was. Now, unknown if that was species wide, or if that was just one individual thing's lifespan. Example, redwoods are several thousand years old, have no known the end of life sequence. They don't die of old age. Some of the oldest redwoods are several thousand years old, and they don't die of old age. They die of some type of a rot or fire or being bulldozed. Lumberjacks cutting them down. There may have been redwoods in the Americas that were 10,000 years old, 12,000 years old. We don't know. The redwood forest down in California, those could have also been 10, 12,000 years old. We have no idea. Because they were all the big ones, all the really, really big ones were cut down 1 and 2.5 centuries ago. Noah's Ark is a direct reflection off of those four Kaaba. The city of IWNW was named as the capital of the Kaabas. The capital city of all the Kaabas that Adam built when he was on Earth. Noah built his ark to reflect the Kaaba system that Adam built. He sailed it from point A, which was wherever he built it, to B, wherever Mount Ararat was, down to dock it next to the city of IWNW, the main temple, and it was docked there. And it remained docked there until a murderous group of Hyksos, which they haven't stopped being murderous, nasty, disgusting, sadistic, brutal, and violent, for the last 6,000 solid years. Every day they're going to find ways to be brutal. They're always being picked on, by the way. The culture has this picked on concept that they can't get rid of, and so since they've been being picked on, they must pick victims and hurt them because they're so picked on. Pure fantasy, but that's not the point. It was sailed out and sailed back because it was completely not there when the Hyksos, or whatever their name was, at 35. When they finally made it to the headwaters of the Nile, they conquered their way up and faced massive resistance all along the way. When they finally conquered to there, the ship was refloated or refixed or remade seaworthy and sailed straight out to safety at either Troy or Poseidon. Poseidon would be renamed Athens several thousand years later, which has a major situation regarding the city of Athens, Theseus, the Trojan War, the founding of Rome. That city is tied into every single one of those subjects and 1,000 more. Not to mention, it's also tied into the Battle of Thermopylae, which was the 300 battle, where the Persian army, renamed Persian from Hyksos, arrived and wanted to kill everybody. If it breathes, it dies. They sailed it out, and then when Pharaoh Narmer took over again and conquered conquered Egypt and reunified Egypt, and he became the pharaoh of both Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north, and created his crown out of the 4 previous crowns that represented north, south, east, west, which would be kind of interesting because of the framework and structure of Noah's Ark, the four trees. Not only the 4 trees that are referenced, but also Noah's Ark and rebuilding civilization based off of the children of Israel lessons and tithings and such. Be interesting and something to research further into. The 4 crowns, the Noah's Ark ship did sit there for hundreds, thousands of years. It was documented as coming and going. That was directly connected to the Sea People. So the Sea People in the Noah's Ark had a similar sized ship. The Noah's Fleet type deal. The Sea People invaded and were treated harshly by the 19th dynasty. The documentation gets a little bit weird and strange because the academics is still highly anti-Jewish and radically anti-Semitic, despite the fact that true lines of Jews have maintained a library for 6,000 years, and the information hasn't changed much for 6,000 years other than it's changed languages. The Nephilim had one very amazing library that was transported in the Ark. The 2x2 animals thing, that's, if you want to believe the theology, go right ahead. But statistically speaking, it more like held a library with a copy of the Tabernacle of Adam system inside of it, which makes the definition of Pharaoh more understandable because it's both a long house and a tall house. The tall buildings are inside the long house, and there's copies of that whole design in Hagia Sophia and 1,000 other cathedrals and churches scattered around Europe. In fact, the first churches were not laid out in the form of a cross. They were laid out in the form of what would be more easily understandable to be a Celtic cross, with the main cross being Noah's Ark ship going north-south, vertical north, and ground south, and east, and the rising and setting sun east-west, north-south, east-west, two Noah's Ark ships, and a cross configuration, and then the base of the crucifixion cross being the surrounding buildings and the surrounding architecture and information or supporting columns. Like Hagia Sophia has two Noah's Arks crossing each other at the center point, which means there's more than enough room for a Kaaba in there, but it also has 4 buildings that are not separated, that are support buildings to keep the roof up, and they sit on the 4 quadrants, and so it's Noah's Ark times 2, and then the 4 Kaaba, for lack of a better understanding, that are holding up the middle fountain. The middle fountain, of course, would be part of Adam's tabernacle design, as well as there were ramps from each of the Kaaba to the platform over the fountain, over the fountain of life, the fountain that all life springs from, that then was divided in 4 and created the 4 rivers of creation, the Tigris, Euphrates, Pishon, and Gihon. Those 4 rivers come from the fountain, and the fountain there was a platform stationed over the fountain. Things become complicated. Noah's Ark was a copy of this, which means that there's no realistic reason why that some version of that was still in existence when Caligula had that ship moved, reconstructed, made shipworthy, and then sailed from Egypt to the Vatican and parked it in the dry dock, and then filled in the dry dock, filling in the marsh, and that became the Vatican, or at least part of, adjacent to where the Vatican would be. The dry dock was extended to where the Vatican sits now, and the ship was taken there and then refilled back in and then made to look not like a ship, although it's very difficult. And it looked like a Noah's Ark type ship from Caligula up to and through when it was partially remodeled. One of the most difficult aspects when you're working on research, specifically research centering on intensely difficult subjects, for instance, the Vatican, history of the Vatican, history of specifically St. Peter's Basilica and the Sistine Chapel, Yes, there's 1,400 years difference between the two constructions, but they are linked, significantly linked. One, they're right next to each other, and two, the whole situation, the Vatican would literally rather be destroyed than to admit. So they've done their best to hide the physical, tangible evidence regarding the subject matter. The Vatican, the building, is a combination of the Temple of IWNW, which had some name between 3500 BC when the Hyksos invaded. Well, whatever they were called previous to their being called the Hyksos. They wouldn't be called the Hyksos until 2100 BC, which is actually a rather significant insult. That insult revolves around male inappropriate interactions with sheep. The Hyksos, their symbol is the sheep. The symbol for Jacob was the bull, which is one of the reasons why the gold, and to prove this, to show the physical tangible evidence of it, is the golden calf, because they only had enough gold. The Jews that were in Moses' Jewish slave shield wall they didn't have enough gold to actually make a full aurochs,